News from Nowhere, and here we see the only illustration in the book, the frontispiece of Kelmscott Manor, which was Morris's house in the countryside of Oxfordshire. And it says there, "This is the picture of the old house by the Thames to which the people of this story went." Hereafter follows the book itself, which is called News from Nowhere, or An Epoch of Rest, and that subtitle is quite important. But first of all, let's have a look at what we mean by utopia. The word utopia was first coined by Sir Thomas More as the title of his 1516 book, which describes a fictional island society in the New World. It literally means no place, and we are talking about any non-existent society when described in considerable detail. But More also pointed out the similarity of that word to utopia, which means a society which is a good place. And it's very clear that Morris has adopted that latter meaning when he's describing his society of the future in News from Nowhere. We can trace proto-utopian ideas back to ancient Greece and Rome, Plato's Republic being a clear example of the genre. They were popular in medieval times as tales or spoken poems, and served as distractions or escapes from the misery of people's existence. In the 14th century land of cocaine, for example, the sun always shone, and the geese flew around ready cooked and waiting to be eaten. This desire for a better world can be seen in the medieval heretics, it can be seen in the peasant revolts of the early Middle Ages. It can be seen during the period of early capitalism with the likes of Thomas More, and it can be seen through the democratic revolts of the 17th century with the likes of the Diggers and the Levellers in Great Britain. It can be seen too in the turbulent development of capitalism in the 18th and 19th century with the ideas of Fourier, Robert Owen and others. And they often involved attempts to set up ideal communities, many religious in origin, such as the Shakers, and some of you might be familiar with Shaker furniture, for example, but others socialistic, such as Etienne Cabet's Icaria and Brook Farm in the USA. Marx would describe people like Fourier and Owen as utopian socialists, for attempting to establish communist communities in the midst of the capitalist system. Utopias, of course, eventually morphed into science fiction, describing new worlds way in the future on distant planets, and they would breed their polar opposite dystopias, which at the current time have become far more popular literary and cinematic genre. And interestingly, when I looked at Christchurch libraries, the only copy of News from Nowhere is in store, whereas there are plenty of dystopias on the shelves. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, utopias were a popular literary form, and socialism, of course, was a rapidly growing social and political movement. Scholars have paid great attention to utopias, and there have been two main ways of reading them. One is to read it as a blueprint for the new society, one that readers are encouraged to adopt as their own social political ideal, and More's was one such. However, in the mid-20th century, the ideas of French philosopher Miguel Abençour came to dominate. He suggested that utopias served to act as a catalyst for the imagination, that they served, in his term, to educate desire. Alternative values, he said, are sketched out in an alternative way of life, encouraging readers to embark upon an adventure, an exploration of values and modes of being. And it's a process without destination, so there is no blueprint at the end of it. The education of desire, says Abençour, therefore absolves utopias from charges of fantasy, totalitarianism or obsolescence. Others, however, have taken Abençour's idea but see it as generative and goal-oriented. Once we have learned to desire otherwise, we can then collaborate on a social blueprint to which we can all subscribe, and we can finally inaugurate utopia. I want to explore News from Nowhere through the prism of these debates and use it to explore the function of utopia. And here's a few thoughts from people whose names you'll probably recognise. Victor Hugo, "There's nothing like a dream to create the future. Utopia today, flesh and blood tomorrow." My favourite, Oscar Wilde, "A map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks at it and seeing a better country, sets sail." In other words, we're always hoping for something better. We're always hoping to find a better world. Alphonse de Lamartine, French philosopher of the 19th century and also French revolutionary, Utopias are often only premature truths. And Emma Goldman points out something which I'm sure many of us are aware of, particularly those of us with a long involvement in the socialist movement. Every lofty vision of new possibilities for the human race have been labelled utopias. In other words, we're always told that they're not possible. So, news from nowhere, and I can only talk from the British experience here, but I'll say a little bit about New Zealand shortly, has long been regarded with affection by all sections of the British socialist and Labour movement. When they did surveys of British Labour politicians in the 1930s and again after the Second World War, they seemed to say that the most read book was News from Nowhere. I have seen no evidence whatsoever to suggest that any Labour politician, the likes of Tony Blair, were actually influenced by what they've read. Scholars too have praised the work. I'm not going to read all these out, but you can see there for yourself some of the comments by scholars of literary scholars as well as political scholars, their views of Morris's work, News from Nowhere. I'm particularly interested in the last one from Perry Anderson, a well-known left-wing intellectual and associated with the New Left in the 1950s and 60s. A feat of moral imagination without equivalent in the work of Marx, ignored without reason by Engels and abandoned without sequel or echo in much of later Marxism. But it's only fair to say that it has also been criticised as impractical, and regressive. So what motivated Morris to write this utopia? It wasn't a novel that emerged from nowhere. It was the culmination of the transformation of his thoughts over several decades, starting with his reading of Ruskin, the impact of his journey to Iceland, his founding of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, his involvement in the UK in the agitation around the Eastern Question, which brought him into collision with the forces of ruling class prejudice and jingoism, and particularly as an artist, his passionate sense of the beauty of the world and its artistic heritage, and appalled by the impact upon it of the industrialisation and the pursuit of profit. And in midlife, he despaired, feeling that he was nothing but a dreamer of dreams, the idle singer of an empty day. And then he read Marx. And so there I was, he said, in a fine pessimistic end of life, if it had not somehow dawned upon me that amidst all this filth, the seeds of a great change, what we call social revolution, were beginning to germinate. And he saw it from thence on as his task to create a vision of reality that would take into account the disastrous alienation of men and women from their social and political conditions. And in the book we have a couple of narrators, but one in particular, Old Hammond. And just bear with me because I'm struggling to hold a microphone and play around with this book here. So Old Hammond, looking back from the 21st century to Morris's time, when the hope of realising a communal condition of life for all men arose, he said, quite late in the 19th century, the power of the middle classes, the then tyrants of society, was so enormous and crushing that to almost all men, even those who had, you may say, despite themselves, despite their reason and judgment, conceived such hopes, it seemed a dream. So much was this the case that some of those more enlightened men, who were then called socialists, although they well knew, and even stated in public, that the only reasonable condition of society was that of pure communism, yet shrunk from what seemed to them the barren task of preaching the realisation of a happy dream. Looking back now, we can see that the great motive power of the change was a longing for freedom and equality, akin, if you please, to the unreasonable passion of the lover, a sickness of heart that rejected with loathing the aimless, solitary life of the well-to-do, educated man of that time. So he sees it as his task to present a picture of hope. Art had to create a new consciousness that moved away from the immediate towards the possible. And in News from Nowhere, through the agency of the dream, and dreams are a familiar trope in utopian literature, Morris can look ahead beyond his own world and is able to see, through his understanding of history, the stages of a living record reflecting the continuity of the struggle. It's not we, he says, in how we live and how we might live, who can build up the new social order. The past ages have done most of that work for us. but we can clear our eyes to the signs of the time, and we shall then see that the attainment of a good condition of life is being made possible for us, and it's our business to stretch out our hands to take it. In all of his lectures and pamphlets on socialism and art, he had been working to develop his thoughts on the future society. In a much neglected lecture, How Shall We Live Then?, delivered first in 1889 and written whilst he was working on News from Nowhere, we find a précis of its principles, offering his personal view of the promised land of socialism. In the first chapter of News from Nowhere, we are told of a discussion at a meeting of the Socialist League, the organisation that Morris had founded in 1884. The narrator, Guest, tells us there were 6 persons present, and consequently 6 sections of the party were represented, 4 of which had strong but divergent anarchist opinions. Morris had become increasingly exasperated with the anarchist section of the Socialist League. As he said, we are working for equality and brotherhood for all the world, and it's only through equality and brotherhood that we can make our work effective. Initially published in his newspaper Commonweal, it's clearly an intervention into the League's internal politics. And News from Nowhere can be seen therefore as an attempt to provide an ultimate goal around which socialists can coalesce and agree. Many have also seen it as a counterblast to a recently published utopia, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, which had achieved considerable popularity, not least here in New Zealand, and I'll come back to that. Although Morris never explicitly said that he wrote News from Nowhere in response to Bellamy, he did write a scathing review of it in Commonweal, referring to it as a Cockney paradise. Set in Boston in the year 2000, it describes a drab, highly regimented, mechanised and centralised society in which, between the ages of 21 and 45, life consists solely of conscripted physical, intellectual and military service. There is strong differentiation between mental and physical labour, and rather than to each according to their needs, goods can only be obtained from the state using a system of labour credit vouchers. Bellamy's new order didn't come about by revolution, but out of the gradual concentration of capital and resources in the hands of private monopolies, eventually merging into what we would call the corporate state. Morris called it state capitalism, we might refer to it as state socialism. But what a contrast to News from Nowhere. Morris portrays an ecological society, a society of autonomous, self-reliant communities where manual and intellectual labour are integrated, work is satisfying and creative, divisions between town and country, between classes, between science and art are eliminated. Goods are made of the highest quality to last as long as possible to minimise ecological damage. Morris shows an instinctive understanding here of Marx's theory of surplus value, for in Nowhere goods are produced for needs rather than wants, which would eliminate surplus value and therefore lighten the load on the rest of nature. And moreover, Morris's ideal society is brought about by the direct action of workers who've been educated by socialists, that education of desire described by Abensauer. I want to digress for a moment, so bear with me, because this is purely out of my own interest here, as to trying to explore why this is, to look at the reception of Bellamy and Morris here in New Zealand. The 1890s saw a veritable explosion of utopian production, and New Zealand, quite bizarrely, seems to have been particularly receptive. In fact, Dominic Alessio has suggested that utopia was central to this nation's culture and resulted in the paradise myth emerging as one of its dominant tropes. It was, after all, the land without strikes. Bellamy's novel enjoyed immense popularity here. It was widely reviewed. Excerpts were published in several newspapers in 1890. William Pemberese serialised it in the Littleton Times, and there were at least 3 local editions, one here in Christchurch. Braithwaite's Book Arcade in Dunedin reported in April 1890 that it had sold 5,000 copies of this marvellous socialistic book. Bear in mind, population of New Zealand then is somewhat less than 2 million, so that's a lot of books. According to the New Zealand Tablet, for some weeks past, the first query on the lips of every second person whom one meets in the street or elsewhere was, "Have you read Looking Backward?" It was read by literary societies, discussed at political meetings and in public lectures. Its utopian programme was picked up by politicians such as James Allen of Dunedin East, and Kate Shepherd, speaking in Christchurch in 1892, made the case for women to be treated as units in the industrial army, a clear reference to Bellamy's book. Many of the leaders of the Labour Party were sympathetic to its ideas, And in 1936, the Edward Bellamy Society of New Zealand, so that's a good 50 years after it was published, was formed in Wellington, with 3 Labour MPs as members and 7 others regarded as sympathetic. And one source says that it undoubtedly influenced the social security scheme that was introduced by the Labour government. As late as the 1960s, former New Zealand Prime Minister Walter Nash said he regarded Bellamy as probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, prophets of the development of the world condition. Morris's book, however, enjoyed nothing like this attention. Now, I find that quite astonishing because, of course, the originators of the New Zealand Labour Party, via its various iterations as the Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Party, and so on, were people from Britain, the Clarion settlers. And the Clarion newspaper was a big supporter of Morris, and there's no doubt that they would have known that book. Although Alexander Turnbull owned a copy, there were no local editions published. Only the Maoriland Worker gave it much attention, describing both its literary qualities and its ability to foster a socialist and revolutionary outlook in its readers. In December 1910, it reprinted a section from chapter 17, How the Change Came, and in January 1914, referring back to the Great Strike in Wellington the previous year, the writer said, "Ye gods, I was living for just a little while in the times of William Morris's News from Nowhere." It was also advertised in Philip Joseph's Library of Anarchism. But why did Bellamy's, looking backwards, sell so many more copies? Why did it receive so much more attention? Well, one commentator has suggested that it had a generic quality which helped it to travel well. Its plan was universally applicable. It was not confined to one particular national context or a socialist sect. There is little uniquely American about it. Morris's Utopia, on the other hand, was written for a revolutionary socialist newspaper. It's clearly set in Britain, and it aims at debates within the radical left, and therefore it is suggested appeal to a narrower readership. Perhaps too, says another commentator, Bellamy's world fitted the colonial longings in New Zealand for city life and its sophistication. Anyway, further exploration needed. So, back to the novel. In the novel, narrator William Guest falls asleep after returning from a meeting of the Socialist League, and wakes up to find himself in a future society based on common ownership and the democratic control of the means of production. This society functions simply because the people find pleasure in nature, and therefore they find pleasure in their work. And during the course of 2 journeys up the Thames, Guest, which is clearly Morris himself, has many questions to ask, and through them explores a number of aspects of this society, including its organisation and the relationships which it engenders between people. On the first journey, from Kelmscott House to the British Museum, he has Dick the Waterman as his guide. But on arriving at the museum, he's introduced to Dick's great-grandfather, Old Hammond. And Hammond's old age and his historical knowledge make him a transitional figure, linking the fallen past to the utopian present. The middle chapters of the book see him answering many of Guest's questions about the new society, and in particular, in the longest chapter, describing how the change came. And this is a pivotal chapter in the book, for unlike most utopias, Morris has located his in an historical context, and he emphasises that such a change had to be fought for. It wouldn't come about purely through the dissemination of ideas. Moreover, whereas many utopias are the product of enlightened figures, paternalists or authoritarians, nowhere is brought about by the working class themselves, who are educated during and by the struggle. The second journey takes the travellers from Kelmscott House to Kelmscott Manor, which I showed you on that earlier slide. And here, Ellen becomes Guest's new guide. She is also a transitional figure. By virtue of her youth and her desire for children, she connects the realised utopian present, the epoch of rest, to an even more advanced stage of historical development to come. Morris pursues his project of building a party of utopia, which is a term coined by American Marxist philosopher and literary critic Frederick Jameson, through Ellen. She plays an essential role in interpolating readers, educating their desire, and ensuring their shared commitment to the utopian vision she emblematizes. And Guest falls in love with her. Vicarious participation in the romance plot is the central mechanism by which News from Nowhere educates the desire of its readers. Guest's passion for Ellen is inextricably bound up with his desire for the world she epitomizes. By falling in love with her, he falls in love with the England of the future. And according to Mark Allison, the reader's libidinal desire is therefore aroused, educated and alchemized into a utopian desire for the ideal society that nowhere depicts. David Leopold has described utopias as having a number of purposes, and I want to use his structure to examine news from nowhere. The first purpose, he says, is construction. Utopia can contribute to building a new society, or at least to make changes to the existing social and political order, and it can help motivate individuals to change the world. Nowhere's social arrangements do provide us with goals. A world where work is transformed from an evil necessity into a creative and fulfilling activity, where production is useful for needs rather than wants, where technology is transformed from the master to the servant of humankind, a world where the state has disappeared and authority is both collective and decentralized, where the antagonism between town and country is mitigated, introducing something of nature into the city and something of the vitality and intelligence of urban life into the rural, and where art has become part of the texture of everyday life rather than a refined cultural sphere available only to the wealthy. In his review of Looking Backward, Morris is at pains to point out that it's a mistake to think of utopia as a complete and final blueprint. Human progress, he says, does not admit of finality, and utopia is bound to contain some errors and some imperfections, based on present-day assumptions and missing or underestimating some factors that will turn out to be crucial. And note, the subtitle of the novel is Some Chapters from a Utopian Romance. In other words, nowhere has a future which is contestable and unpredictable. The second function, transition. As I've already suggested, nowhere has a specific history. It was fought for, and how the change came was based on Morris's own experience of past events in the UK, such as, say, Bloody Sunday in Trafalgar Square, the strike wave of 1888 and 1889, and also his reading of events in Paris during the Paris Commune in 1870-71. So his revolution hasn't come from nowhere. It's the outcome of an extended period of class struggle. In the first stage, a period of economic crisis, culminating in a terrible one in 1952. So this is the period at which Morris had originally set this romance, but he later had to recognise it was going to take longer than that, leads to the federated societies, or the trade unions, to demand that all the resources and means of production be transferred to the combined workers, a declaration of class war. During stage 2, a mass meeting in Trafalgar Square is attacked by police, leaving 5 dead and many injured. A further meeting causes even more casualties, but on this occasion, the police are routed. And in London, a committee of public safety becomes an alternative source of authority and begins to requisition food and other necessities. The government declares a state of emergency and puts London under martial law. At another meeting in Trafalgar Square, resulting in a massacre, many of the troops, however, are horrified and refuse to fire, and they change sides. In the third stage, a general strike is called, and a new network of workers' associations, what we would now call workers' councils, are formed. A form of rudimentary communism is established, with the councils organising food production and distribution. After a temporary truce, civil war breaks out, caused, says Hammond, by the capitalist class lashing out in impotent rage. A war which lasts for 2 years and causes enormous destruction. During the conflict, the needs of the moment draw out the organisational skills of the working class and other latent talents, which after their victory are used to inaugurate the communist society. So the key features here, and this is a really pivotal chapter, as I've said, is 1, his emphasis on the class struggle. Unlike the negative views of the working class held by some socialists, Morris has faith in their instinct for freedom. Secondly, the importance of working class self-liberation. There's no emphasis on leaders. Note the shift from the Committee of Public Safety to the Workers' Councils. And he's here echoing the founding statement of the International Working Men's Association, founded by Marx, that the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself. 3, the vital importance of socialist education in bringing it about. And 4, the contempt in which he held Parliament, which was not, he said, a genuine democracy. As old Hammond puts it in the book, was not the Parliament on the one side a kind of watch committee, sitting to see that the interests of the upper classes took no hurt, and on the other side a sort of blind to delude the people into supposing they had some share in the management of their own affairs? Thirdly, motivation. Values and ethics are abstract. Sterile facts and programs are unlikely to motivate. The working class needs a sense of what might be. As Guest says, if I could but see a day of it. He needs to renew his motivation after the sterile Socialist League meeting. And in the book's closing paragraphs, Morris contrasts wistful dreams with active and practical visions. Throughout his lectures and in News from Nowhere, he stresses the importance of vision. And I suggest this is a midway point between the imagination and desire that Abensur stresses and utopias which present a blueprint of the future society. Guest's final words, if others can see it as I have seen it, then it may be called a vision rather than a dream. He hopes that what he's experienced might be a premonition that will guide and motivate him and fellow socialists to bring about a time of fellowship and happiness. The vision need not be exhaustive or closed, but it must be substantial enough to inspire and sustain a party, Jameson's Party of Utopia. Fourthly, a critical function. Social criticism helps us to reflect on the flaws of current society, and it can shock us out of our pessimism or familiarity. On his first morning in the new society, Guest goes for a swim in the River Thames. And he's so astonished by his sight of Hammersmith Bridge that he forgot to strike out, spluttered, and went under. Because Hammersmith Bridge is looking attractive. It's made of well-weathered stone. It's not covered and blackened by soot. And all along the bridge are houses and small shops and dwellings. It's a living sort of entity, if you like, which, of course, bridges in the Middle Ages, if you go back to medieval times, always had buildings on them and houses and people living there. But he was so astonished at the change from the bridge in his own time that he almost drowned himself. Direct criticism explicitly identifies flaws in the system. Guest criticizes the architecture of his world. Hammond, the poor quality of manufactures then. Hammond says in the 19th century there was so little art and so much talk about it. Now it's part of everything and there is no separate word for it. Indirect criticism, on the other hand, implicitly draws attention to a flaw in the present by portraying a society that doesn't contain it. So an example would be the clothes worn by the inhabitants of Nowhere, particularly the women, flowing and loose-fitting, comfortable and attractive. And Morris had referred previously to the upholstered armchairs of the Victorian age, which was his description of women dressed in those broad corsets with, big upholstered armchairs. I'm sure you get the picture. I have it pictured in my head, but I can't put it into words. But I know what he means. Utopias as a thought experiment. They ask us to think about values, about the kind of institutions and the ethos that might embody them. They can ask us questions about the desirability, feasibility, and access of particular social arrangement. Nowhere challenges Guest's ways of looking at life, his conventional thoughts about punishment and about work, for example. He asks Hammond, how do you get people to work when there's no reward of labour? And especially, how do you get them to work strenuously? Hammond's answer is that work is either an intrinsic pleasure or the pleasure that comes through being a service to the community. If the work is too disagreeable, he says, then we use machinery. Or we ask the question, can we do without it? Pleasurable work is central to Morris's vision of a communist society. Revelation. Utopias can reveal things about the society in which they were written, and also something about the personality and values of the author. In News from Nowhere, Morris talks about an imperfection in the present world which he regards as universal. In other words, whatever the utopia, we're not going to be able to get away from this, namely the fickleness of the human heart or love. The only crime committed in Nowhere is a murder resulting from a love rivalry. However, it's a non-universal question where present-day socialists would find issue with Nowhere, what we call the woman question. And before I get assaulted, the woman question was a burning debate in the socialist movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, and that's the name they gave it. So don't throw things at me. And it's this question which jars and reveals that Morris hasn't entirely been able to shake off the shackles of his own time. And I want to come back to that issue separately. And finally, says Leopold, utopias offer both escape, hope, and cheer. Reading News from Nowhere can offer a diversion or escape from the harsh realities of life. May Morris suggested that her father wrote it for precisely that reason, to escape from the dissension that was then tearing the Socialist League apart. They also offer hope, as in Guest's new understanding and appreciation that another way of life is possible and that we can actually struggle to achieve that. And they also entertain and cheer the reader. There's lots of laughter in News from Nowhere. Its inhabitants laugh at Guest and his questions and misunderstandings. Guest laughs at himself, the frequent association of work and laughter. And there's humour in the text itself. You know, the Socialist meeting, the Socialist League meeting. 6 people present, representing 6 different views. Those of us who've been in socialist organisations of one sort or another might recognise that. And his description of Parliament as now being used as a dung market, which I love. But I want to turn now to 3 specific aspects of News from Nowhere. Morris's views on human nature, as expressed in the novel, the economic arrangements of the new society, and finally, his views on the woman question. As mentioned earlier, there are lots of references to happiness in the book. Its inhabitants are happy and cheerful folk with an intense love of life, sometimes referred to by Morris as the religion of humanity. Critics say that this ignores the reality of human nature. And of course, the Judeo-Christian tradition, rooted in the concept of original sin, says that all we can hope for is God's grace and forgiveness. When Guest questions Hammond about this, referring to the religion of his own time, he replies that thoughts of bliss beyond the grave are pointless. We're too happy, both individually and collectively, to trouble ourselves about what is to come hereafter. But the logical outcome of the Judeo-Christian tradition, of course, is that human beings need to be controlled and repressed. Thomas Hobbes and Edmund Burke in the 17th century and 18th century argued that human beings were essentially uncooperative and indecent animals. Freud talks about man the egotist, Darwin about man the predator. And in this tradition, private property is seen as an absolute need rooted in human nature. But there were opponents of this intellectual hegemony, dating back to a British monk in the 5th century, Pelagius, who refused to accept the notion of original sin. Others wrote of pre-fall golden ages, referred to often as primitive communism, Engels being an obvious example. Early utopias saw purely physical fantasies, the land of cocaine that I referred to earlier. But from John Locke onwards, philosophers provided depictions of transformed human behaviour, arguing that human beings were largely the products of their environment and upbringing. Whereas the utopian socialists of the early 19th century thought you simply needed to educate people to live in a cooperative community, Morris, as a Marxist, could only see successful cooperation within certain material circumstances, in other words, a classless society. The culture of men, he said, was determined by economic relationships, and capitalism nurtures us to see as natural conditions which in fact are historical and relatively transient. Most utopias before Morris, and indeed quite a few afterwards, have been rooted in an authoritarian tradition. More's utopia portrayed social regimentation and indoctrination. Bellamy, a militarized labor force controlled by an industrial officer class. In Etienne Cabet's Icarian community, where there is only one state-approved textbook. Skinner, in Walden 2, in the 1960s, uses environmental manipulation to reward good and bad behavior. Paternalist employers like Robert Owen impose their own moral codes as norm. But Morris, on the other hand, whilst accepting the basic premise of the perfectibility of man by the amelioration of his surroundings, says not via state legislation or benevolent employers. News from Nowhere is a non-authoritarian utopia. Look at education in Nowhere. There are no schools as we understand them. No utilitarian classrooms or statist indoctrination. No intellectual elite to direct. Learning is relaxed and non-regimented, combining both practical skills and intellectual pursuits. There are no police, prisons or law courts. As Hammond says, the majority of crime is the result of private property or property-based relationships. And where social transgressions do occur, they're seen as the errors of friends rather than the habitual actions of persons acting against society. After 150 years of communism, the inhabitants of Nowhere are both reasonable and practical. And note also, there is the freedom to dissent. In one chapter, titled The Obstinate Refusers, we talked about builders who want to continue building rather than participate in haymaking, which is meant to be an occupation where everybody collaborates, and that's fine. Nobody forces them to do that. This nature and nurture debate is a long and hard-fought one, and it's still going on, let's be honest. Boot camps in 2025 New Zealand, to which News from Nowhere makes a vital contribution. And look how over time our views on things such as child beating and capital punishment have changed. Secondly, the economic features of the society.
The historical tradition is very clear about what a communist society looks like. Common ownership of the means of production and distribution, access to goods according to need. But Morris wanted to bring this alive for people via a vision of what it might be like and how it could work in a society without money and without coercive government. A community of equals, having full and free access to the means of production, would use them to provide useful things to satisfy both individual and collective needs. And production would be directly for use, not for a market aimed at making a profit. Several times gets into difficulty in Nowhere when he tries to pay for things. And Morris introduces the subject of money very early in the book, in chapter 2. And it's worth reading this extract in full. Bear with me again. So Guest has just been rowed across the river by Dick, the waterman. And I put my hand into my waistcoat pocket and said, "How much?" He looked puzzled and said, "How much? I don't quite understand what you are asking about. Do you mean the tide? If so, it is close on the turn now." I blushed and said, stammering, "Please don't take it amiss if I ask you. I mean no offence, but what should I pay you? You see, I am a stranger and don't know your customs or your coins." And therewith I took a handful of money out of my pocket, as one does in a foreign country. He still seemed puzzled, but not at all offended, and he looked at the coins with some curiosity. I thought, well, after all, he is a waterman and is considering what he may venture to take. He seems such a nice fellow, I'm sure I don't grudge him a little overpayment. Wherewith my new friend said thoughtfully, "I think I know what you mean. You think I've done you a service, so you feel yourself bound to give me something, which I am not to give to a neighbour unless he has done something special for me. I've heard of this kind of thing, but pardon me for saying that seems to us a troublesome and roundabout custom, and we don't know how to manage it. And you see, this ferrying and giving people casts about the water is my business, which I would do for anybody. So to take gifts in connection with it would look very queer. Besides, if one person gave me something, and then another might, and then another, and so on, I hope you won't think me rude if I say that I shouldn't know where to stow away so many mementos of friendship." Within such a framework, obviously, some decision-making is necessary. And while Morris doesn't deny the need for some central coordination, in Nowhere power flows from the bottom up. Administrative functions are devolved to local communities and groups of producers. Hammond, in chapter 14, tells us that the decision-making body is the general meeting, or mote, of the community. Consensus is the norm, but as a last resort, a majority of vote, if all agree to accept the result. These motes will be linked in a federal structure with delegates from each local community. And the role of the centre is to gather information about what goods are needed and pass that information on to the community to produce. This would be done in physical quantities, not money. In other words, the centre acts as a stock controller and not an accountant. The basic industrial unit is the guild, and they're organised on the same federal structure. Under the previous system, Hammond tells us, the world market meant production whether needed or not. The production of artificial necessities shoddily made, whereas under communism, production is for local use. It is clear from all that we hear and read, says Hammond, that in the last age of civilization, men had got into a vicious circle in the matter of production of wares. They had reached a wonderful facility of production, and in order to make the most of that facility, they had gradually created a most elaborate system of buying and selling, which has been called the world market. And that world market, once set going, forced them to go on making more and more of these wares, whether they needed them or not. So that while, of course, they could not free themselves from the toil of making real necessaries, they created in a never-ending series sham or artificial necessaries, which became, under the iron rule of the aforesaid world market, of equal importance to them with the real necessities which supported life. By all this, they burdened themselves with a prodigious mass of work merely for the sake of keeping their wretched system going. And then, since they had forced themselves to stagger along under this horrible burden of unnecessary production, it became impossible for them to look upon labour and its results from any other point of view than one, to wit, the ceaseless endeavour to expend the least possible amount of labour on any article made, and yet at the same time to make as many articles as possible. To this cheapening of production, as it was called, everything was sacrificed. The happiness of the workman at his work, his most elementary comfort and bare health, his food, his clothes, his dwelling, his leisure, his amusement, his education. His life, in short, did not weigh a grain of sand in the balance against this dire necessity of cheap production of things, a great part of which were not worth producing at all. So, in a communist society, wares are produced for need, and the production for local use will be supplemented as necessary by transfers of essential materials and products not available everywhere. Conventional economics tells us this is impossible. Abundance is an unrealistic assumption. Capitalism tells us that human wants are limitless. But needs are not abstract. They are the concrete needs of concrete individuals in a concrete social context. Food, clothing, housing, a life free from material insecurity, non-material needs like community and enjoyment from working. Are there sufficient resources for this? Yes. Choices would have to be made on the basis of available physical resources, but such an economy is an ecological imperative in this current age. And so finally, to the woman question. A burning question and a controversial one in the socialist movement of the time. Whilst the promise of an entirely restructured way of life under socialism attracted many articulate and active women, many socialist men held traditional views on both the present and future position of women. Some thought it was an issue to be deferred until after the revolution, that social class was the key determinant of women's lives and that a classless society would resolve the issue. Even Marx, in Volume 1 of Capital, had written that within a family there springs up naturally a division of labour, caused by differences of age and sex, a division that is consequently based on a purely physical foundation. In other words, this form of division was natural, whereas the division of labour in industry was not. Engels differed in the origins of the family, private property and the state. Written in 1884, he traced the rise of patriarchal oppression to the development of private property and civilization, as contrasted with what he saw as the previous primitive communism. Class oppression, he said, coincided with that of men over women. And the first condition for the liberation of women is to bring the whole female sex back into public industry. And that in turn demands the abolition of the monogamous family as the economic unit of society. As you can imagine, that last phrase alarmed respectable society, and the word free love emerges. But Engels didn't mean monogamy would disappear. The overthrow of capitalism, he said, will bring marriage based on true sexual love and inclination, and if that comes to an end, then couples will separate with no censure or penalty. August Bebel, in Women Under Socialism, or Woman Under Socialism, echoed this view and argued for absolute equality for both genders. It should be the equal duty of all to labour, he said, without distinction of sex, for the general good. And women should have the same education as men and should be able to choose their occupation. Eleanor Marx and Edward Aveling, Eleanor Marx, of course, Karl Marx's daughter, had perhaps the most advanced views on the topic of the woman question. They saw the principal goal of marriage as mental, social and sexual companionship, with complete female independence to choose from the full range of creative occupations. Most socialists saw no need for birth control, arguing that a better distribution of resources would remove the need and seeing no danger at that time of overpopulation. Engels and Bebel, however, did separate marriage from child rearing, assuming that the larger society should assume some responsibility for childcare to enable the woman to work. What then of Morris? His writings had always demonstrated a sympathetic view of the constraints on women's lives. Those of you who attended my first talk on Morris will remember the tensions and difficulties of his own marriage to Jane and her affair with Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And this reinforced his belief in a woman's right to sexual choice. And prior to having children, his wife Jane had overseen the embroidery department at his firm. May Morris, his socialist daughter, confirmed his view that women had a valuable contribution to make to the cause. And he also worked alongside other key female figures in the socialist movement in the late 19th century, Eleanor Marx, Annie Besant, and others. And he was very familiar with Louise Michel, who was a refugee from the Paris Commune and had been one of that large number of women fighters in the Commune who had to be exiled abroad. So he was therefore motivated towards a contemporary socialist feminist position. He is, after all, on record as saying that he did not consider a man as a socialist at all who is not prepared to admit the equality of women. But according to Florence Booth, considerations of political expediency and personal acquaintance intervened. Those with the most advanced views on the position of women in society, Engels, Eleanor Marx, Aveling, also favoured working through Parliament to achieve a socialist state. And so they took the opposite side to Morris in that debate. One who did take Morris's side, however, was the arch-misogynist Ernest Belfort Bax, a horrible man. He was the co-editor of Commonweal. He'd co-authored Socialism, Its Growth and Outcome with Morris, and he drafted the manifesto of the Socialist League with him. Morris needed his support in the quarrels and arguments that were splitting the Socialist League at the time. Did this prompt him to compromise his views? Well, Bose has found what she calls the most unfortunate letter Morris ever wrote. In it, whilst he argues that socialists must claim absolute equality of condition between women and men, he goes on to say, but you must not forget that childbearing makes women inferior to men. Since a certain time of their lives, they must be dependent on them. It would be poor economy setting women to do men's work, as unluckily they often do now, or vice versa. Once he was no longer reliant on Bax's support, however, and no longer felt the need to defend him, his views modified. And it's certainly clear in News from Nowhere that he's taking seriously the debates about women's freedom in an ideal society, and he explores them in some detail. He supports the right of all women to personal and sexual autonomy. A genuine socialist revolutionary, he says, must fully accept the emotional freedom of their fellow human beings, even if it comes at an emotional cost to themselves. Of course, when he found out about his wife Jane's affair with Rossetti, he removed himself from the equation. He went to Iceland and left the pair at Kelmscott Manor on their own, because in Victorian society, female adultery was far more heavily criticised than any form of male adultery, and he didn't want to bring shame on his wife. So we see this early on in the novel. Guest is surprised that Clara, who left Dick for another man, has suffered no legal or social penalties. But of course there were no legal contracts of marriage. One of the grossest inequities of Victorian society, as I've just suggested, was the heavy penalty imposed for female adultery, what Eleanor Marx and Edward Aveling termed one law for the woman and one for the man. When Clara and Dick are reconciled, there are again no recriminations. Let's look further. After Guest has met Dick for the first time, along with Robert the Weaver, they enter Hammersmith Guest House, where they are greeted by 3 young women. They are attractively dressed, happy and healthy, and they wait on the men at table. And Robert pats one of them on the head in a kindly manner. Women's good looks are repeatedly stressed, and this depiction of beauty, pretty clothes, domestic graces is hardly an attractive one for 21st century feminists. The women are decorative and they are contented. In another chapter, they're pictured happily watching the road mending gang, who are all men and shirtless in the sun. When Guest questions Hammond about the woman question, he's told that women's emancipation is a dead controversy. The women do what they can do best, says Hammond, and what they like best, and the men are neither jealous of it or injured by it. Housework, he says, is an important and respected occupation. So there is clearly still gendered division of tasks in Nowhere. And when Guest suggests that the new society might see the emancipation of women from childbirth, this is also dismissed. Maternity is highly honoured. It's an extra stimulus to affection between couples, says Hammond, and in a land where there is equal access to wealth, mothers are spared economic anxiety and artificial burdens. Love, as I mentioned earlier, is seen as the cause of what sadness and conflict do exist in Nowhere. Hammond suggests it's a point of honour with us not to be self-centred, and this obviously stems from Morris's own stoical response to Jane's affair with Rossetti. He had said then, how I long to keep the world from narrowing on me and to look at things bigly and kindly. But he does point to male egoism and impulses towards revenge as greater threats to domestic harmony than female disloyalty or maternal irresponsibility. And the reality of the 19th century, of course, is that male desertion of the female partner and male violence towards women was by far the greater problem. Are then romantic love, motherhood and happy housekeeping all that Nowhere offers women? No. Social and personal relations are more variable and flexible than this implies. The female characters are lively, acute and generally wiser than the men. And they feature more largely in the second part of the book, particularly as Ellen joins the group on their journey up the Thames. She takes on the role of utopian interlocutor and guide, and she's praised for her knowledge, intelligence, ability and sensitivity. The women all participate in haymaking. Philippa is regarded as the best carver or architect and accorded high status. She's also one of the obstinate refusers. Whilst Ellen and Philippa may be exceptions to the rule, and beyond housekeeping most of the women may be leisured, but Nowhere is subtitled after all an epoch of rest. Morris is only too aware of the backbreaking and exhausting lives of working class women in the 19th century. On the issue of gender then, Morris is to some extent a product of his time, and Nowhere is a very masculine version of Paradise. And as a literary text, it is imbued throughout with longing and masculine desire. Guest responds sexually to all the women he meets, but particularly Ellen, but of course he wakes from his dream before fulfillment. But it's this longing which drives news from Nowhere, which is used as a metaphor for utopian desire. If I could but see a day of it, says Guest, if I could only see it. The book, in the end, offers Morris's answers to a number of frequent objections to socialism, and it underlines his belief that socialism will entail not only the abolition of private property, but also of the divisions between art, life and work. But it's more than that. As his latest biographer Fiona McCarthy suggests, it's a most wonderfully disconcerting work, a visionary landscape, both decorous and lavish, mysterious and homely, and an extraordinary and deeply imagined image of urban possibility. Thank you. Silence. I know Tom's going to ask a question, but we'll just see if anybody else has got one first. No.
Thank you, Martin. That was great. It was really interesting. I really appreciated it. I guess my question is around News from Nowhere gives us a lot of ideas about what maybe like future society might look like, and some ideas about how it might get there, around the transition and stuff like that. But I wonder what you think around William Morris's thought and what we could learn for kind of very immediate things, like what from like his philosophy, like his particular way of thinking about socialist politics, do you think is immediately applicable to our current context, which is not particularly heightened, but nonetheless somewhat desperate in the sense of like the need for change is massive, but the desire for it is low. What should we do?
Right, okay. Several responses to that, I think. Just to say that Morris, in the earlier years of his socialist politics, did think very clearly that we could dispense with Parliament and that we could go straight to a socialist state through revolution. He modified those views towards the end of his life and accepted that it was going to take longer and that we would probably have to go through some form of interim phase, even using Parliament as a sort of vehicle for this interim phase. So he kind of thought that Bellamy's state socialism, as he described it, or state capitalism as he described it, but state socialism as we'd call it, that we would probably have to have some version of that as a halfway house on the way to socialist revolution. It's interesting that when he originally wrote it, the revolution was like 50 years after his time. By the time it eventually appeared, it was into the 21st century, so he'd really prolonged his time scale. In terms of immediate relevance to now, I think there's lots of things that happen that are, if not inspired by Morris, then certainly redolent of his thought. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, how community comes to the fore in times of disaster. The earthquake in 2011, for example. I mean, I wasn't here, but plenty of people have told me about how people got together, they cooperated, they shared out the food that they had, they invited people around to their house if their own house was damaged, etc., distributed water and all these sorts of things. That happens in disasters time after time after time. And the question arises then, well, why, if we can do that at times of disaster, why doesn't that carry on? And the answer, of course, is, I guess, the vested interests of those people in whose interests it's not what they want. In other words, the people who want to carry on making money and profit. But there's also all the little examples. I mean, around where I live, there's 2 or 3 community gardens, doing all sorts of things. People turn up, they're working together communally. The one nearest to me, Richmond Community Gardens, they've now opened a community cafe, and they've got a community farmers market, and it's a really thriving little community enterprise. And there's another one at Darlington. I know there's one in the town centre. So there's examples of things like that where communities are doing things and doing things on the lines of what Morris was talking about. You see in advanced cities, shall we say, we see a lot of greening, if you like, the replanting of trees, rooftop gardens, all those sorts of things to mitigate the climate change. I was reading about a wonderful initiative in, I can't remember which African country it was today, but where the whole community is going out and planting trees around the town and in the streets and what have you to push back the desert, basically, as it's happening. I was reading another thing today about the women of Rojava, the women who actually fought and defeated ISIS when they invaded and kicked him out, and have now set up a really emancipated community where women are running their own affairs, or at least have an equal share in running affairs. Perhaps that's more. And you think there's loads of examples, of where communities are cooperating and working together. And particularly on the ecological side, I mean, whether it's the predator-free campaigns here, whether it's the community gardens, even things like, obviously, the things like food banks and so on, whilst we don't want those and no civilized state should have them, but nonetheless, that is people getting together and saying, we've got to do something. So I think there's lots of examples where if you read Morris and then go, hang on a minute, what he's saying is not so utopian. There's examples of people doing this all the time, but it's just never, how should we say, coordinated into a genuine attempt to change the whole system. It's always piecemeal and bits and pieces. But I mean, if you've read the latest climate change report, I can't remember which group of scientists it said, but I was just saying to Paul, it says basically we've got 20 years. We've got 20 years, and then we are going to be in deep trouble. And if all of these little ecological and communitarian experiments are not taken up by governments, and if governments aren't going to take them up, if people don't then do something about it, then, you know, the future, not for my children, but certainly looking around here, the future of other people's children, you know, the next generation is bleak. It's bleak. So I think we've got beyond the stage of saying, well, News from Nowhere offers us hope. I'm saying it actually does offer us an alternative way of looking at things, you know, because even now, in spite of what we see of homeless people on the streets and all that, there are plenty of resources. There's no dispute about that. There's plenty of resources. It's just the way in which we use them. And it's the way in which we spend so much time producing stuff that we genuinely do not need, you know. And then that creates the ecological issues that we've got. And we don't spend the time working on the things that are really important. So, it's been suggested that Morris's is not an actual blueprint for a utopian society. And he said himself, he just wanted people to think, A, to think of an alternative, and secondly, to realise that we have the power to make it different. And if we accept that, then we can do something. And, you know, those of us who've been involved in the socialist movement for a while know that it's easy to give up and get fed up and despair. But I think Morris's message there is, you know, don't. We've got to keep going. I don't think that's a particularly good answer to your question. It's certainly not a full answer. But there's so many examples of people working together when it counts, when it's needed. And then afterwards it seems like we just go, well, that's a one-off. Now things have got to go back to where they were. We can't change. We can't make that a permanent change. Well, why can't we? Why can't we, you know? Just out of interest for me, how many people have read News from Nowhere? Oh, not bad. Thank you very much. That's good. Yeah. Okay. As I said, it's only in the store at the library, but it's worth a read. You know, if you okay, slightly archaic language, obviously, and it's talking about now 130 years ago. God help us, but yeah, and it's well worth reading in contrast to looking backward, because there's two totally different visions of a utopian society and what that would look like, or a socialist society, sorry, and what that would look like. Yeah, I think the Canterbury Socialist Society is much more akin to Morris in the way in which we look at things and in which we hope we might change things. So, you know, if you're not a member, do come and join us.